The first time Mason Cole dumped a cup of mop water over Ruth Bellamy's head, he did it with a smile. The kind of smile a man wears when he thinks the whole room belongs to him. He told her to clean it up, told her people like her should be grateful they had a badge at all, and then he walked away like he had just solved the business problem, instead of humiliating an old woman in front of half the night staff. What Mason did not know, what nobody in that polished glass tower knew, was that Ruth Bellamy was not Ruth Bellamy at all. She was Eleanor Whitcomb, the woman who had built Bellamy Ridge Financial from a two-room office above a laundromat in Ohio into one of the most respected payment technology companies in America. Now, I know that sounds like one of those stories people exaggerate at a diner after church. The kind where somebody says, well, my cousin's neighbor knew a woman who owned the whole building. But this one had receipts, and by the time it was over, 4 executives who thought they were untouchable were being escorted out past the same janitors they used to pretend not to see. Eleanor Whitcomb had never been the type of woman who looked rich. Even after she became rich, she still wore soft cardigans, kept peppermint candies in her purse, and drove the same beige Lincoln until her son practically begged her to let it retire with dignity. She had grown up outside Toledo, raised by a mother who cleaned hotel rooms and a father who fixed boilers in public schools, so the smell of bleach and floor wax never embarrassed her. If anything, it reminded her of home. When she started Bellamy Ridge back in the late 80s, she was 31, recently widowed, and tired of watching banks treat working people like they were a problem to be managed instead of customers to be served. She built software that helped small credit unions process payments faster, then payroll tools for local businesses, then security systems for online banking before most folks even trusted online banking. And every step of the way, she kept one rule taped to the inside of her desk drawer: never make money by forgetting people. That was Eleanor. She believed the receptionist deserved the same hello as a board member, that a cleaner who worked at midnight should be treated with the same respect as a vice president in a corner office. And if you think that sounds old-fashioned, maybe it is, but it worked. Bellamy Ridge became the kind of company people stayed at for 20 years. The kind where employees brought their kids to the summer picnic, where the cafeteria ladies knew who liked extra mustard, where Eleanor walked the floors without an entourage and asked people how their knees were holding up. Then age started tapping her on the shoulder, quietly at first, then a little louder. Her hands ached in the morning. Her patience for quarterly investor theater got thinner, and her only son, Daniel Whitcomb, had grown into the kind of man she believed could carry the company forward. Daniel was sharp, decent, maybe too trusting, but he had heart, and Eleanor had raised him on the same values she had built the company with: dignity, fairness, and the radical idea that nobody becomes bigger by making somebody else feel small. So she stepped down, moved into a smaller advisory role, then stepped farther back when the board told her she had earned rest. For about a year she tried. She planted tomatoes. She joined a book club where nobody finished the books but everyone had opinions. She baked too much banana bread and dropped it off at Daniel's apartment like he was still in college. But then the phone call started. Not formal complaints, not official memos, just little whispers from old employees who still trusted her. A payroll clerk she had known since the 90s told her people were crying in bathrooms again. A security guard said the night staff had started keeping their heads down because certain managers enjoyed making examples out of them. A retired assistant mailed her a handwritten note that said, "Ellie, I do not recognize the place anymore." At first, Eleanor told herself every company goes through rough patches. New leadership, new market pressure, new people trying to prove themselves. It could all look ugly for a season. But the stories kept coming, and they all had the same shape. The lower you were on the ladder, the less human you were treated. The names came up again and again too. Mason Cole, head of operations, a man Daniel trusted because he delivered clean numbers and cleaner presentations. Bryce Landon, the marketing director with magazine teeth, in the habit of calling people inefficient when he meant beneath me. Paula Hensley from Human Resources, who had once been kind but had apparently learned to smile while shutting doors. And Celeste Marrow, senior vice president of corporate strategy, a woman so polished she looked like she had been assembled in a boardroom. Eleanor listened to all of it, and the part that hurt most was not the cruelty itself, though that hurt plenty. It was the fear in people's voices when they told her not to mention their names. That was when she knew she had a choice. She could call Daniel, storm into the building, and demand answers like the founder she was, which would give every guilty person 2 days to clean up their behavior and hide the smell. Or she could do something a little foolish, a little theatrical, and very much like the woman her husband used to call dangerous when she got quiet. She became Ruth Bellamy. The name was a private joke. Bellamy from the company name. Ruth, because her mother had always said Ruth was a woman in the Bible who knew how to survive hard fields. Eleanor cut no corners. She bought gray work pants, plain shoes, thick glasses, a cheap silver wig, and a shapeless custodial jacket that made her look older than she felt, which was saying something because some mornings her knees already sounded like popcorn. With help from an old facilities supervisor who owed her more loyalty than the current leadership knew, she got placed on the night cleaning crew as a temporary hire. She did not tell Daniel. That was the hardest part. She loved her son, but love can blur truth, and she needed to see the company without anybody performing goodness for her. On her first night, she entered through the back loading dock while rain tapped against the metal awning and delivery trucks hissed along the alley. The main lobby, the one with the marble wall and the giant Bellamy Ridge logo, was only a few dozen feet away, but Ruth was not allowed through that entrance. Ruth came in past the dumpsters, past the cigarette butts, past the security guard who barely lifted his eyes from a basketball game on his phone. Eleanor paused just inside the service hallway and looked at the building from a height she had never seen before. Not physically. The place felt different from down there. The lights were colder. The carpets looked more expensive. The silence had edges. She touched the plastic name badge clipped to her jacket and swallowed something sharp. Ruth Bellamy, night custodian. That was all she was now. Her supervisor, a tired man named Luis Ortega, handed her a cart and spoke in the low, practical voice of somebody who had survived a lot by not attracting attention. Restrooms on 36, executive hallway on 38, conference suites if they leave them open, and if Mr. Cole says redo something, just redo it. Eleanor looked at him. Even if it is already clean, Luis gave her a sad little smile. Especially then. That should have told her everything. But pride is strange. Even when you are undercover, even when you asked her the truth, part of you still hopes the truth will be kinder than the rumors. It was not. Mason Cole appeared before midnight like he had been summoned by entitlement itself. Tall, square-jawed, expensive watch, blue tie tight enough to suggest he had never once relaxed on purpose. He stopped in the hall where Eleanor had just finished mopping and looked down at the shine like the floor had personally offended him. "New temp?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Eleanor said, keeping her voice small. Mason looked at her badge, then at her face, then at the cart, and his mouth curled. "Ruth? Well, Ruth, this floor better look like glass by morning. We have investors in tomorrow, and I do not need them thinking we hire people who move like they are waiting for the bus to heaven." A young analyst nearby choked on a laugh, then looked away when Eleanor glanced over. She felt heat rise in her neck, not because the joke was clever, it was not, but because nobody challenged it. That was the first real warning. Bad people are loud, but bad cultures are quiet. Eleanor nodded and said, "I will take care of it." Mason took 2 steps forward, right across the wet floor, leaving dark prints from his polished shoes. Then he looked back at her as if daring her to react. "Missed a spot," he said. Eleanor stared at the footprints. In her old life, she had once negotiated a $40 million acquisition in less time than it took that man to disrespect a mop line. But Ruth only bent down, wrung out the mop, and cleaned the floor again. The second warning came from Bryce Landon, who stepped out of the marketing suite wearing a slim black sweater and the expression of a man who believed kindness was bad branding. He held a glass of sparkling water and a stack of papers, though Eleanor soon learned he only carried papers so someone else would have to pick them up. "You are not supposed to be near this door while we are working," he said. "I was assigned this hallway," Eleanor replied. Bryce tilted his head. "He signed this hallway," Eleanor replied. Bryce tilted his head. "Listen, Ruth, we do strategy in there. Big thoughts, high-value work. So when you roll that little cart around, it creates a certain atmosphere. You understand?" Eleanor wanted to ask if the atmosphere he preferred was one without evidence of labor, but she only nodded. Bryce smiled like he had won something. "Great." Then he opened the folder in his hand, let half the paper slide to the floor and said, "Since you are already here?" It was such a small cruelty, almost childish, which somehow made it worse. Eleanor knelt slowly, gathering the papers, and saw 3 young employees watching through the glass wall of the conference room. One woman looked ashamed. One man looked shamed. One man looked scared. One just looked tired, like he had seen this episode before and knew there was no changing the channel. By the end of that first week, Eleanor had learned the building had 2 companies inside it. Upstairs, in board decks and recruiting videos, Bellamy Ridge was innovative, inclusive, people first. Downstairs, after 6 o'clock, it was a kingdom of little tyrants. Janitors were called by the wrong names on purpose. Security guards were blamed for broken systems they did not control. Assistants were told they were replaceable whenever they asked for overtime pay that had already been earned. The coffee bar stayed stocked with oat milk for executives, but the cleaning crew had to bring their own soap if the supply order got delayed. And through it all, Mason Cole moved like a sheriff in a town with no laws, checking corners with a white cloth, tapping trash bins with his shoe, asking people if they were stupid or just lazy, always with that same smile. One night, Eleanor watched him corner a young custodian named Marisol near the elevators after she dropped a spray bottle. It made a harmless little crack against the tile. Nothing broke, nothing spilled beyond a few drops, but Mason spun around as if she had thrown a brick through a church window. "Do you know what this floor costs?" he snapped. Marisol froze. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. It slipped." "It slipped," he repeated, loud enough for 2 interns to hear. "That is always the excuse with people like you. Things slip. Standards slip. Opportunities slip. Opportunities slip. Then is wonder why you stay exactly where you are." Marisol's face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for Eleanor to see the practiced collapse of someone who had learned not to defend herself. Her shoulders folded inward. Her eyes dropped. "I will clean it," she whispered. "You will clean the whole elevator bank," Mason said. "Again." Eleanor stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Mr. Cole," she said gently. "I can help her. It was an accident." Mason turned. "Oh, Ruth has opinions now." The interns went still. Eleanor felt every year of her life press against her ribs. "I only meant it would be faster if we both handled it." Mason walked close enough that she could smell mint on his breath. "Faster is not your concern. Obedient is your concern." He let the words hang there, then pointed at the floor. "Both of you, start over." Marisol would not meet Eleanor's eyes after that. Not because she was angry, but because gratitude can be dangerous in a place where the walls have favorites. Later in the supply closet, she whispered, "You should not have done that. He likes breaking new people." Eleanor asked, "Has anyone reported him?" Marisol gave a soft laugh without humor. "To who? Paula?" That laugh stayed with Eleanor longer than Mason's insult. So on Monday afternoon, before her night shift, Eleanor went to Human Resources. She had to sign in at reception under Ruth Bellamy, wait 22 minutes while 3 people walked past her pretending not to see her, then finally sit across from Paula Hensley in an office decorated with framed words like integrity, respect, and belonging, which Eleanor found almost rude under the circumstances. Paula had been with the company for 15 years. Eleanor remembered her as a sincere woman who used to ask follow-up questions and remember birthdays. This Paula looked thinner, sharper, varnished over. She listened with one hand on her mouse and the other resting near her phone like Ruth might steal it. Eleanor explained the repeated humiliations, Mason's threats, Bryce's deliberate messes, Marisol's treatment, the fear among the staff. Paula nodded in the way people nod when they are waiting for you to finish being inconvenient. "I understand these situations can feel uncomfortable," she said. Eleanor sat very still. "Feel uncomfortable?" Mason Cole publicly threatened a young employee for dropping a spray bottle. Bryce Landon intentionally creates messes and makes staff redo completed work to embarrass them. Paula folded her hands. "Ruth, I want to be careful here. Senior leaders are under tremendous pressure. Sometimes expectations can come across as harsh to support staff who may not understand the stakes." There it was. Support staff. Eleanor had heard nicer terms for furniture. She leaned forward slightly. "Does company policy allow managers to degrade employees?" "Of course not," Paula said quickly. "But tone is subjective. And frankly, Ruth, you are temporary. My advice is to focus on your duties. Avoid interpreting leadership behavior personally. And remember that not every difficult interaction is mistreatment." Eleanor looked at the wall behind Paula's desk where the word belonging sat in brushed silver letters, shining like a joke nobody had the nerve to finish. "I see," she said. Paula smiled, relieved to be near the end. "Good. We are all on the same team here." Eleanor stood, and for one brief second, Paula's eyes flicked over her uniform with something like disgust, or maybe fear disguised as disgust, or maybe fear disguised disgust. Either way, Eleanor understood. HR was not broken by accident. HR had chosen comfort over courage. By the time Friday came, Eleanor had stopped hoping for one bad apple and started counting barrels. That was the night Celeste Merrill entered the story. The executive conference suite on 42 had been booked for a late strategy session, and Ruth was assigned to clean it beforehand. Eleanor had just finished wiping the long walnut table when Celeste walked in with 6 employees behind her, all carrying laptops and folders like shields. Celeste had a silver bob, cream-colored heels, and the kind of calm face that made people apologize before knowing what they had done. She stopped when she saw Eleanor. "Why is there a cleaner in here?" Eleanor lowered her cloth. "I'm almost done, ma'am. This room was scheduled for service at 7. Celeste looked at one of her assistants. Did we ask for commentary? The assistant stared at the floor. Eleanor said, I apologize, I just need 2 minutes. Celeste took a slow breath through her nose. No. What you need is a reminder. This room is for leadership. You do not linger around leadership. You do not explain procedure to leadership. You do not unclock back to leadership. You do not linger around leadership. We do not claim procedure to leadership. Eleanor felt something old and hot stir in her chest. I was not talking back, Mrs. Marrow. I was answering your question. The room went silent so fast, even the air conditioning seemed to hesitate. Celeste turned fully toward her. What did you say? Eleanor knew she should stop. Ruth would stop. Ruth would lower her head because Ruth had rent. Ruth had prescriptions. Ruth had no board seat hidden in her past. But Eleanor had spent a week swallowing poison, and for 1 second, her real voice slipped through. I said I was answering your question. Celeste crossed the room in 3 clean steps and slapped her. It was not a wild slap. That almost would have been easier to understand. It was controlled, deliberate, delivered by a woman who knew exactly how far she believed her power reached. Eleanor staggered back, one hand flying to her cheek, the cloth dropping to the carpet. Someone gasped. No one moved. Celeste's face barely changed. Now you have your answer, Ruth. Finish cleaning and get out. Then she turned to her staff and said, Meeting starts in 5, as if she had only adjusted the thermostat. Eleanor stood there with her cheek burning and her eyes wet. And for a moment she was not the founder, not the legend, not the woman whose signature was still on the company charter. She was just an old woman in a gray uniform standing in a room full of people who had decided her dignity was optional. That was the moment something inside her broke, but not in the way Mason or Bryce or Paula or Celeste would have wanted. It did not break downward. It broke open. She thought of Marisol on the elevator bank, Louise warning her to redo clean work. The analyst who laughed because he was scared not to. The old note that said, Ellie, I do not recognize the place anymore. She pressed her palm lightly to her cheek, picked up the cloth, and finished the table because Ruth Bellamy still had a job to do. But when she pushed her cart into the service elevator 10 minutes later, she looked straight into the little scratched mirror on the back wall and whispered, All right then, no more guessing. By sunrise, Eleanor Whitcomb had stopped being a witness. She was going to become evidence. Eleanor did not sleep that morning. Not really. She went home, took off Ruth Bellamy's gray custodial jacket, hung it over the back of a kitchen chair, and stood there in the pale blue light before sunrise with one hand resting on the cheek Celeste Marrow had slapped. And the strangest thing was, she did not feel defeated. She felt clear. There are moments in life when anger is messy, when it makes you say too much or move too fast. But then there are moments when anger sharpens you, when it walks into the room, sets its purse down and says, All right, now we are going to do this properly. That was the kind of anger Eleanor had. She made coffee so strong it probably could have negotiated a bank loan by itself, sat at her little kitchen table and opened an old leather notebook she had not used since her CEO days. On the first page, she wrote 4 names: Mason Cole, Bryce Landon, Paula Hensley, Celeste Marrow, and beneath them she wrote one question. Are they cruel because they are careless, or are they careless because they are hiding something worse? That question bothered her more than the slap. Cruel people in business do not always stop at being cruel. Sometimes cruelty is the smoke, and what is burning underneath is greed. Eleanor knew she could not walk into the boardroom with stories and feelings, because stories can be twisted and feelings can be dismissed, especially when the person telling them is wearing a name badge that says temporary. She needed proof. Clean proof, the kind nobody could talk around with corporate language and nervous laughter. By noon, she had made 3 calls, one to a retired security consultant who had installed half the company's early access systems, one to a former compliance attorney who still sent her Christmas cards, and one to Luis Ortega, the night supervisor, who answered on the 3rd ring and sounded like a man expecting bad news. Luis, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. There was a pause, then he said, Ms. Whitcomb, I figured this day was coming. Eleanor closed her eyes. So you knew. Not at first, he said, but nobody mops with that much judgment in their shoulders unless they used to run something. Despite herself, Eleanor laughed, just once, soft and tired. I need to know if I can attach a small camera and audio recorder to my cart without putting your job in danger. Luis was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My job has been in danger since Mason Cole learned my name. Do what you need to do. That night, Ruth Bellamy returned to Bellamy Ridge Financial with a tiny camera tucked into the front lip of her supply cart, a second one clipped inside the pocket of her uniform, and a small recorder hidden beneath a packet of cleaning wipes. Nothing dramatic, nothing spy movie flashy. No sunglasses, no lasers, Just an old woman pushing a squeaky cart through a building full of people who had forgotten that quiet does not mean powerless. Eleanor was careful. She did not bait anyone. She did not start conversations. She did not exaggerate reactions for the camera. She simply worked, and the building did the rest. Mason found her before 11, of course he did. Men like Mason can smell someone lower on the payroll the way a dog smells bacon. He watched her wiping the glass panels outside the executive suite and said, "Ruth, I swear, every time I see you, you're moving slower. Are you cleaning the glass or trying to remember your childhood?" Eleanor kept wiping. "Almost finished, Mr. Cole." He stepped beside her, leaned close to inspect a panel that was already spotless, then pressed his thumb against it, leaving a deliberate print. "Not anymore. Start over." She looked at the thumbprint, then at him. "Yes, sir." That was all she said, but the camera saw his smirk, heard his little satisfied breath, caught the way two junior managers passed by and pretended not to notice. Later, Bryce Landon staged his usual performance in the marketing lounge, dropping a smoothie across a table Eleanor had just cleaned, then lifting both hands as if gravity had betrayed him. "Well, look at that," he said, smiling at the young woman beside him. "Good thing Ruth lives for purpose." The young woman did not laugh this time. Her name was Tessa. Eleanor had learned, 26, assistant brand strategist, always carrying 3 notebooks and the expression of a person 1 email away from crying in her car. Bryce noticed her silence and turned his charm on like a switch. "Tessa, come on, we are having fun." Tessa swallowed. "I just think maybe it was already clean." The room shifted. It was tiny, almost nothing, but Eleanor felt it. Bryce's smile thinned. "Thank you for the facilities insight, Tessa. Maybe next week you can explain marketing to the mop." Eleanor bent to clean the smoothie, but inside she was filing it away. Not just Bryce's insult, Tessa's courage too. Cultures rot slowly, but they heal the same way. One small brave sentence at a time. The recordings piled up over the next several nights. Paula telling a payroll clerk that unpaid overtime sounded like a communication issue, not a violation. Mason threatening to cut cleaning hours because people who needed money should learn efficiency. Bryce joking that custodians were cheaper than office plants and only slightly less decorative. Celeste telling her assistant to delete a calendar invite so Daniel would miss a finance review, then saying, "If he cannot keep up, that is not our problem." That last one made Eleanor stop the recording and play it twice. Daniel would miss a finance review. Why would Celeste want that? The next evening, Eleanor started paying closer attention to patterns, not just insults. Mason kept visiting floors outside his department. Bryce took late meetings with people from vendor management. Paula carried printed personnel files into rooms where HR had no scheduled business. Celeste spoke in lowered tones whenever Daniel's name came up. And Daniel himself, poor trusting Daniel, seemed to be slowly fenced in by people who smiled in his face and moved things behind his back. Eleanor saw him once from across the lobby after hours. He stepped out of the elevator with his jacket over one arm, looking exhausted, still kind enough to thank the security guard by name. For 1 second, she almost called out to him. "Danny, sweetheart, your mother is dressed like a building ghost and everyone has lost their mind." But she did not. She watched him walk toward the front entrance, phone pressed to his ear, trusting the people around him to tell him the truth. That was the cruelest part of betrayal, she thought. It does not just steal from you, it makes your goodness look foolish. The real break came on a Thursday night during a storm that rattled the windows so hard the whole tower seemed to breathe. Most employees had gone home early, but the executive level stayed lit, little squares of gold floating in the dark city. Ruth was assigned to restock the private restroom near the 43rd floor conference wing, an area she normally avoided unless told otherwise. Around 10:30, she heard voices coming from the smaller strategy room at the end of the hall. The door was not fully closed. At first, she thought it was another late meeting, nothing unusual. But then she heard Celeste say, "Daniel is running out of time," and Eleanor's hand froze around a roll of paper towels. She moved her cart slowly, softly, positioning it near the door as if she were checking supplies, the recorder already running. Mason's voice came next, low and irritated. "He is asking too many questions about the margin shift. I told finance to bury the variance in the regional reports, but he is not as clueless as you think." Bryce scoffed. "He is sentimental, not clueless. Big difference. Sentimental people can still spreadsheets if you put enough red flags in front of them." Paula said, "I can handle the personnel side. 3 directors are ready to sign statements about Daniel's instability if needed. Stress, erratic decisions, failure to communicate, all the usual language." Eleanor felt her stomach turn cold. Celeste answered, "Good. The board does not need a scandal, they need a story. Daniel inherited a company too large for him. Daniel resisted modernization. Daniel lost confidence internally. Then we step in as the responsible adults. Mason laughed softly. Responsible adults. I like that. And the subsidiary transfers. Bryce lowered his voice, but the recorder caught him. Already moving. The consulting contracts are clean on paper, but the money lands where it should. Once Daniel is out, we accelerate the vendor renewals, sell the data partnership as an innovation play, and nobody asks why our friends are suddenly very well paid. Paula added, and if Eleanor starts sniffing around. The room went quiet. Eleanor stopped breathing. Celeste said, Eleanor is a retired old woman with tomatoes and nostalgia. Let her bake bread. Mason chuckled. Besides, if she saw the night crew now, she would have a stroke before she made it to the boardroom. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cart handle. That was the closest she came to opening the door right then and there. Maybe in a movie she would have done it, stepped in dramatically, revealed herself, watched their faces fall, and we all would have clapped. But real life is less generous than movies. Real life requires patience when your blood is boiling. So Eleanor stayed still. She recorded everything. The fake reports, the plan to pressure Daniel into resignation, the money being routed through shell consulting agreements, the confidential client data they intended to use as leverage in a partnership with a competitor. It was not just workplace abuse anymore. It was a slow-motion corporate hijacking, wrapped in strategy language and dry-clean suits. When the meeting ended, Eleanor ducked into a storage alcove as the four of them came out. Mason passed closest, still laughing. Bryce said something about celebrating when the old Bellamy ghost was finally gone. And Celeste replied, ghosts only matter if people believe in them. Eleanor waited until their footsteps faded, then stepped back into the hall with her heart pounding so hard it made her ears ring. She pushed the cart to the service elevator, rode down alone, and in the scratched metal reflection she saw Ruth Bellamy looking back at her, small, tired, invisible. Then she looked closer and saw Eleanor Whitcomb behind the disguise. And Eleanor was not invisible at all. At home, she reviewed the footage until the sun came up. She watched Mason's thumbprint, Bryce's smoothie, Paula's dismissal, Celeste's slaff, then the secret meeting 3 times, pausing to write notes, dates, timestamps, names. By breakfast, her kitchen table looked like a tiny war room. Printed still frames, audio transcripts, a rough map of money movement based on what she had overheard. She called Martin Vale, the retired compliance attorney, and sent him encrypted copies. He called back 20 minutes later and said only one thing. Eleanor, this is not office politics. This is criminal exposure. I know, she said. Does Daniel know? Not yet. Martin exhaled. Then tell him before they do. That was how Eleanor ended up standing outside her son's apartment at 5:40 in the evening, wearing her own clothes again. A blue cardigan, pearl earrings, no wig, no thick glasses, holding a USB drive in one hand and a paper grocery bag in the other. Because even when your company is being betrayed, apparently a mother cannot show up empty-handed. Daniel opened the door and smiled in surprise. Mom, what are you doing here? Eleanor lifted the bag. I brought soup. He blinked. You hate making soup. That is how you know it is serious. His smile faded. He stepped aside. The apartment was neat but tired, the way single men's apartments get when they are technically clean but spiritually abandoned. A laptop sat open on the kitchen island, brief finance reports spread beside it, a half-eaten sandwich dry into a legal document. Daniel looked older than he had 6 months ago. Eleanor felt a mother's guilt rise in her throat. She had stepped away because she believed he needed room to lead. Maybe she had left him in a room full of wolves. They sat in the living room and for a minute Eleanor could not speak. Daniel watched her carefully. Mom, what happened? She took his hand. Danny, I need you to listen all the way through before you react. That is never a comforting sentence from a parent. I know. She tried to smile, but did not stay. I went back to Bellamy Ridge. His brow furrowed. Back how? I took a temporary night custodial job under the name Ruth Bellamy. Daniel stared at her. The silence stretched so long Eleanor could hear the refrigerator hum. Finally, he said, You did what? I know. You disguised yourself as a janitor. Yes. At our company. Yes. Without telling me. Also yes. Daniel stood up and ran both hands through his hair. Mom, are you serious right now? You are 72. 71 until November. That is not the point. I know it is not the point. She said gently. The point is people were afraid to tell you the truth, and I needed to know why. Daniel looked hurt then, not angry. Hurt. You could have come to me. Eleanor nodded. I could have. But if I had, you would have asked the people around you for explanations, and they would have given you polished lies. His face changed at that. What people? Eleanor placed the USB drive on the coffee table, Mason Cole, Bryce Landon, Paula Hensley, Celeste Marrow. Daniel looked at the drive but did not touch it. What are you saying? I am saying they are abusing staff, falsifying internal narratives, moving money through control consulting channels, preparing statements to paint you as unstable, and planning to push you out before the next board vote. The words landed one by one, and with each one, Daniel seemed to lose a little color. That is insane. Eleanor wished it were. I recorded them. Daniel picked up the USB like it might burn him. Mom, tell me this is not what I think it is. She looked at him, and this was the hardest part. Harder than the slap. Harder than the mop water. Because a mother never wants to be the person who breaks her child's trust in the world. It is exactly what you think it is. They watched the footage together. Daniel did not speak when Mason insulted Ruth. His jaw tightened when Bryce mocked Tessa. He looked away when Celeste slapped his mother, then immediately looked back, as if looking away was its own kind of cowardice. But when the secret meeting played, when he heard Paula say she had directors ready to sign statements about his instability, something in him went still. Not weak still, dangerous still. He paused the video and stared at the frozen image of 4 people he had trusted sitting around a table like they had already divided up his life. I promoted Mason, he said quietly. Eleanor said nothing. I defended Bryce to the board. She waited. Paula sat in my office last week and told me I needed better boundaries because I was checking too many reports myself. His mouth twisted, almost a laugh, but not quite. And Celeste told me you seem lonely in retirement. Eleanor gave him a sad little smile. Well, to be fair, the tomatoes were not great this year. Daniel looked at her and despite everything, he laughed once, a broken little laugh that turned into a breath. Then his eyes filled, and he looked down. I am sorry. No, Eleanor said firmly. Do not start there. I should have seen it. Maybe not. Betrayal is not always loud, Danny. Sometimes it brings you coffee, agrees with you in meetings, and uses your decency as a blindfold. He swallowed hard. What do we do? Eleanor leaned back, and for the first time since she put on Ruth Bellamy's uniform, she felt the weight of the next move settle into place. We do not warn them. We do not confront them privately. We do not give them time to destroy evidence or shape the story. We call an emergency board meeting. Daniel nodded slowly. Present the footage, the financial irregularities, the HR failures, all of it, and I appear as Ruth one last time. Daniel looked up sharply. Absolutely not. Mom, no. Yes. No, they already humiliated you enough. Eleanor's voice softened. That is exactly why. They need to show the board who they are before they know who I am. Daniel stood and paced to the window, looking out at the city lights. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, without turning around, he said, When I was a kid, you used to tell me leadership is what you do when nobody important is watching. Eleanor smiled faintly. I said that. You said it constantly. It was annoying. Good. You remembered. He turned back to her and the boy was gone from his face. In his place was the man she had hoped he would become. Wounded, yes. Shaken, absolutely. But awake. Then we let them talk, he said. We let the board see it. Eleanor nodded. And when they are done proving our case for us, we tell the truth. The next 24 hours moved with a strange calm. The kind that comes before a hurricane, when the sky looks almost polite. Daniel contacted Martin Vale and 2 outside forensic accountants. He quietly secured copies of financial records, access logs, vendor contracts, deleted calendar histories, and HR complaint files that had been marked resolved without investigation. What they found was worse than even the recording suggested. Cleaning staff complaints had been buried. Overtime disputes had been dismissed. 3 managers who questioned budget transfers had been pushed out. Consulting payments had gone to entities tied to Mason's brother-in-law. Rice's college roommate and a shell firm, Celeste, had apparently been very careful not to mention in disclosure forms. Paula's fingerprints were everywhere, not as the mastermind maybe, but as the person who made consequences disappear. Daniel read each file with a kind of quiet grief. Eleanor watched him become less naive by the hour, and it hurt her. But she also knew this was what growth sometimes looked like. Not a ladder, not a speech, not applause, but the awful moment you realize being kind does not mean being soft and trusting people does not mean refusing to verify. The emergency board meeting was set for Monday at 9 in the morning on the 44th floor, the same conference level where Celeste had slapped Ruth. Daniel's official notice said only that urgent governance and ethics matters required immediate board review. Mason replied within 4 minutes, all confidence and punctuation. Happy to align, though I hope this is not another overreaction to temporary market noise. Bryce sent a thumbs-up emoji, which Eleanor found so irritating she almost admired the commitment to being unbearable. Paula asked if HR should prepare talking points. Celeste did not reply at all. That worried Eleanor most. Smart predators do not bark when the trap moves. Sunday night, Eleanor laid out Ruth Bellamy's uniform on her bed one last time. The gray jacket looked smaller now, almost harmless, but she knew better. That uniform had carried insult, fear, evidence, and more truth than any executive badge in the building. She ran her fingers over the cheap plastic name tag and thought about all the people who wore real ones every night. People who could not take them off and return to being founders. People who lived inside the disrespect she had only borrowed. That thought steadied her. Monday morning, rain washed the city clean but left the sky low and silver. Eleanor entered through the loading dock again, not because she had to, but because Ruth would. Lewis was there holding a clipboard, pretending very badly not to be emotional. "You sure about this?" Eleanor smiled. "Louise, I've survived venture capitalists, bank regulators, and a toddler Daniel with the stomach flu. I can survive one board meeting." He shook his head, but his eyes were wet. "Give them hell, Ruth." Eleanor pushed the cart into the elevator. On 44, the hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and thunder. Board members were already arriving through the main corridor. Men and women in dark suits, murmuring with concern. Mason stood near the conference room door laughing with Bryce, though his laugh had a hard edge. Paula checked her phone over and over. Celeste stood by the window perfectly composed, which told Eleanor she was either innocent or very dangerous, and at this point Eleanor had ruled out innocent. Daniel stepped out of his office at exactly 8:57. He looked across the hallway and saw Ruth with her cart. For one heartbeat, mother and son simply looked at each other. No hug, no nod big enough for anyone to notice, just a shared breath. Then Daniel walked into the boardroom, shoulders squared, carrying the truth in a slim black folder. Eleanor lowered her head and began wiping an already clean side table outside the door. Mason glanced at her and frowned. "You again," he muttered. "Perfect." Eleanor said nothing. Inside, the boardroom doors began to close, but not all the way. Daniel's voice came through calm and firm. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. What I am about to present concerns not only misconduct within this company, but a coordinated attempt to undermine its leadership, its employees, and everything Bellamy Ridge was built to stand for." Outside the room, Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cart handle. Mason's face darkened. Bryce stopped smiling. Paula went pale. Celeste finally turned from the window, and Ruth Bellamy, the invisible old janitor they had all dismissed, stood just beyond the doorway, waiting for the exact moment when the people who thought they owned the company would learn they had been performing for the woman who created it. For a few seconds after Daniel said those words, nobody inside the boardroom moved, and Eleanor could feel the silence pressing against the walls like weather. That was the thing about real trouble in a company. It did not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrived with a sentence spoken calmly by the one person everyone had mistaken for too decent to fight back. Mason Cole recovered first, because men like Mason usually do. Not because they are brave, but because arrogance has a fast engine. He pushed his chair back hard enough that it scraped across the floor and said, "Daniel, this is a serious accusation, and frankly, it is reckless." Bryce gave a little laugh, the kind he used when he wanted younger employees to know they had said something career-limiting. Paula leaned forward with her HR face already arranged, soft eyes, fake concern, hands folded like she was about to help someone through grief she caused. Celeste did not speak at all, and that worried Eleanor more than the others, because Celeste understood the danger of the moment before Mason did. Daniel stood at the head of the long table, not raising his voice, not pacing, not performing outrage. Eleanor had seen him nervous 1,000 times in his life, before school recitals, before his first investor pitch, before asking a woman named Claire to marry him, though Claire had said no, which Eleanor still believed was a sign of excellent judgment from the universe, but this was different. He looked wounded, yes, but steady. He said, "I will give everyone in this room the chance to see what I have seen." Mason scoffed. "And what exactly have you seen? Some spreadsheet variants, some disgruntled employee whining because they did not get promoted." Daniel looked at him for a long second. "You should be careful, Mason. Disgruntled employees are often the first people honest enough to tell the truth." That landed. Eleanor saw through the narrow gap in the door. One board member, a woman named Harriet Sloan, who had been with the company almost as long as Eleanor herself, shifted in her seat and looked toward Mason with new attention. Mason noticed it too, and like a man losing control of a room, he searched for something smaller to attack. His eyes slid to the doorway, to Ruth Bellamy and her cleaning cart. "Of course," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Of course this is what we had become. We are having a governance meeting and there is a janitor standing in the hall listening like this is community theater." Bryce turned and smirked when he saw her. Paula closed her eyes briefly, as if Ruth was an inconvenience she had specifically asked life not to schedule. Celeste finally spoke, smooth as glass. Daniel, perhaps we should close the door and remove unnecessary personnel. Daniel did not look away from Mason. Ruth is fine where she is. Mason laughed, and the laugh had teeth in it. Ruth is fine where she is. Are you hearing yourself? This is exactly the problem. You want to run a national financial technology firm like it is your mother's charity kitchen. You cannot tell the difference between leadership and sentiment. Then he pointed straight at Eleanor, still not knowing, still so sure the world was built in layers and she was trapped at the bottom. That woman should be cleaning restrooms, not standing near confidential board matters. Ruth, he snapped, get your card and leave before I have security remove you. Eleanor felt something almost peaceful settle over her. Not joy exactly, not revenge, more like the quiet that comes when a storm has finally reached the house and there is nothing left to do but open the door. Daniel said, Mason, I'm going to ask you one time to stop speaking to her that way. Mason turned red. Or what? Eleanor stepped into the room. The wheels of the cleaning cart made a soft clicking sound over the polished floor, and somehow that tiny sound became the loudest thing in the building. Board members turned. Bryce leaned back, amused. Paula whispered, Ruth, this is not appropriate. Celeste's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a real calculation crack through that perfect face. Eleanor stopped beside Daniel, took off the thick glasses, folded them, and set them on the conference table. Mason frowned. Then she reached up and removed the silver wig. It came free in one clean motion, and her own white hair, pinned beneath it, loosened around her face. Nobody spoke. It is funny what shock does to a room. All those wealthy, educated, powerful people who could talk for 20 minutes about risk exposure or market expansion, suddenly forgot how breathing worked. Harriet Sloane stood first, one hand against the table. My God, she whispered. Eleanor. Bryce's smile disappeared so completely, it looked like someone had erased it. Paula's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, which was the most honest thing Eleanor had ever seen her do. Mason stared at her with the blank horror of a man realizing he had insulted a door, kicked it, spit on it, and only now discovered it was the entrance to the courthouse. Celeste, to her credit or her damnation, went pale but did not look away. Eleanor looked around the boardroom, at the portraits on the wall, at the skyline beyond the glass, at the table where she had once signed agreements that kept families employed and small banks alive. Then she said, Good morning. I suppose I should introduce myself again. My name is Eleanor Whitcomb. I founded this company. For the past several weeks, most of you have known me as Ruth Bellamy, night custodian, temporary hire, restroom cleaner, and in Mason Cole's preferred language, someone who should remember her place. No one moved. Eleanor rested one hand on the back of a chair. I came back because people were afraid, not annoyed, not resistant to change, afraid. They told me this company had become a place where titles matter more than character, where lower-wage employees were treated as furniture with pulse rates, where HR had become a quiet little room for burying inconvenient pain. I did not want to believe them. I wanted very badly not to believe them. So I came in through the loading dock, wore a fake name, pushed a cart, cleaned your offices, emptied your trash, and listened. Her eyes moved to Mason, swallowed. Eleanor, this is obviously a misunderstanding. She smiled gently, and somehow that made him look even smaller. Mason, you poured dirty water over my head and told me to clean it up. I would love to hear the misunderstanding. A board member made a small sound, half gasp, half disgust. Mason looked at Daniel. Daniel, I did not know it was her. That was when Daniel's face hardened in a way Eleanor had never seen before. That is the problem. Mason, you thought she was nobody. The room went silent again, but this time, it was not shock. It was judgment. Eleanor turned to Bryce. Mr. Landon, you staged messes, mocked support staff, and treated junior employees like an audience for cruelty because you thought humiliation made you look powerful. She turned to Paula. Ms. Hensley, employees came to you with fear, and you handed them policy language like a wet blanket. She turned to Celeste. Mrs. Marrow, you struck me across the face in this very suite because I answered a question you asked me. Celeste finally moved. Eleanor, I regret that interaction, but I was under extreme pressure, and the circumstances were not presented accurately. Eleanor nodded once. I expected better wording from you. That was thin. Daniel inserted the USB drive into the conference system. The screen at the end of the room lit up. Eleanor stepped aside. I am not asking this board to take my word for it. The first video played. Mason's thumb pressing into clean glass, his voice telling Ruth to start over. Then Bryce spilling a smoothie and joking about purpose. Then Paula dismissing complaints as interpretation. Then Celeste's laugh. The room watched in sickened silence. The sound of the slap through the speakers was small, sharp, and final. Harriet Sloane sat down slowly, one hand over her mouth. Another board member cursed under his breath. Bryce looked at the table. Paula began to whisper something about context, but Daniel raised one hand and she stopped. Then came the secret meeting. Mason's voice about bearing margin variances. Paula describing statements about Daniel's instability. Bryce talking through consulting contracts and money landing where it should. Celeste explaining that the board did not need a scandal. It needed a story. The camera angle was not perfect. The audio was not studio clean, but it was more than enough. In fact, the roughness made it worse because it felt real. Because it was real. It was a door cracked open on the kind of betrayal people usually only discover after the damage is done. Mason stood so quickly his chair nearly tipped. This is illegal surveillance. Martin Vale, the retired compliance attorney, who had been sitting quietly near the far end of the table at Daniel's invitation, finally spoke. What is illegal, Mr. Cole, is the fraudulent movement of corporate funds, coordinated efforts to mislead the board, retaliation against employees, and conspiracy to disclose confidential client information. But please, tell us more about the camera on the cleaning cart. Mason's mouth shut. Bryce looked like he might be sick. Paula started crying, not from remorse, Eleanor thought, but from the terrible surprise of consequences. Celeste, still composed but visibly shaken, said, Daniel, think carefully. A public scandal would damage the company. Daniel looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. No, Celeste, you damaged the company. Telling the truth is how we stop the bleeding. Harriet Sloane stood again, this time with her shoulders squared. I move that Mason Cole, Bryce Landon, Paula Hensley, and Celeste Marrow be suspended immediately pending termination, forensic audit, and referral to appropriate authorities. Another board member said, seconded. Daniel looked around the room. All in favor. Every hand went up, no hesitation, no polite abstentions. Even the newest board member, a private equity man who usually spoke only in percentages, raised his hand like he wanted distance from the smell of the thing. Mason tried one last time. Eleanor, after everything I have done for this company. Eleanor turned to him, and for a moment she looked almost sad. That is the sentence guilty people love most, Mason. They list what they have done and hope nobody asks who they did it to. He had no answer. Security entered, two men Eleanor recognized from the lobby, both looking deeply uncomfortable and maybe a little satisfied. Daniel's voice was firm. Please escort them out. Their system outs has already been revoked. Company devices will be surrendered before they leave the floor. All evidence will be preserved for outside investigation. Mason looked stunned, as if the idea of rules applying upward had never occurred to him. Bryce stood without a word, his expensive sweater suddenly looking like a costume. Paula dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, still performing innocence for an audience that had left her. Celeste gathered her folder with careful hands, then looked at Eleanor and said, You should have stayed retired. Eleanor met her eyes. And you should have remembered the cleaners know where everything gets hidden. That one got a reaction. Not laughter exactly. The room was too heavy for that, but a ripple, a release, the first breath after a long-held silence. Celeste walked out last. The door closed behind them with a soft click, not dramatic, not thunderous, just final. For a while, nobody spoke. Eleanor stood beside the cleaning cart in the middle of the boardroom, the wig lying on a table, the screen still frozen on the faces of the four people who had almost stolen the company from the inside. Daniel turned to the board. What happened here is not over because 4 people left the room. If we treat this as a personnel issue, we deserve to fail. This was a system failure. Complaints were buried. Fear became normal. People learned that silence was safer than honesty. That changes today. Eleanor felt pride rise in her chest so suddenly it almost hurt. Not because Daniel sounded like her, but because he sounded like himself. Finally awake to the cost of leadership, he announced an outside audit, a full review of HR, anonymous reporting channels managed by a third party, direct board oversight for ethics complaints, back pay reviews for hourly workers, and mandatory leadership evaluations tied not just to revenue but to employee treatment. Then Eleanor spoke again, softer this time. I want every person in this company to understand something. Respect is not a motivational poster. It is not a paragraph in an employee handbook. It is what happens when nobody thinks the person in front of them can help or hurt their career. That is when character tells the truth. She looked at Ruth's name tag in her hand. I wore this badge for a few weeks. Some people wear one like it for years. They do not get to take it off and become a founder when the shift ends. They go home tired, sometimes hurt, sometimes invisible, and then they come back because bills do not care about dignity. If Bellamy Ridge cannot honor those people, then it does not deserve its name on the building. Harriet began clapping first, then another board member, then Daniel. The applause was not loud at first, but it grew, and as strange as it looked, a room full of executives applauding an old woman in a custodial uniform beside a mop bucket. It felt more honest than any awards banquet Eleanor had ever attended. News of the firings moved through the company faster than any official memo could have. By lunch, everyone knew something had happened upstairs. By 2 o'clock, people knew Mason was gone. By 3, Bryce's office was locked, Paula's name was removed from the HR portal, and Celeste's assistant, the same young woman who had stood silently during the slap, sat in a restroom stall and cried with relief. Louise found Eleanor near the service elevators late that afternoon. She was still wearing the gray jacket because she had not quite been ready to take it off. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "So, do I still need to tell you if the conference rooms are behind schedule?" Eleanor smiled. "Absolutely. Standards matter, Louise." He laughed, then shook his head. "You scared the life out of them." "No," Eleanor said, looking down the hallway where Marisol was speaking with Daniel himself, nervous but smiling as he listened to her. "I think they scared the life out of everyone else for too long. We just gave it back. The months after that were not magical." That is important to say. In real life, justice does not roll credits and fix payroll by Monday. People were still cautious. Some did not trust the new reporting system at first. A few managers left when they realized kindness was not optional anymore. The audit was ugly. The legal process was uglier. Mason tried to claim he was a scapegoat. Bryce found a podcast and called himself a victim of anti-ambition culture, which Eleanor thought was so absurd she almost sent him a dictionary. Paula cooperated after her lawyer explained reality to her. Celeste fought longest because pride often outlives strategy. But slowly, Bellamy Ridge began to feel like itself again, not the old company exactly, because you never truly go backward, but something wiser. Daniel started holding monthly listening sessions with hourly employees. No cameras, no press, no executives filtering questions. The first one had 12 people and a lot of silence. The third one had 80 people and a waiting list. Marisol became part of a new workplace council. Louise got the facilities budget he had been requesting for 2 years. Tessa, the young marketing employee who had dared to say the room was already clean, was promoted 6 months later. Not as a reward for bravery exactly, but because once Bryce was gone, people noticed she had been the one doing half the work anyway. Eleanor did not return as CEO. She did not want the chair back. She had worn enough costumes. Instead, she became a formal ethics advisor to the board, which sounded fancy, but mostly meant she walked around the building once a week, talked to people at inconvenient times, and asked questions that made managers sweat politely. On the first anniversary of what employees quietly started calling the Ruth Day meeting, Daniel held a company gathering in the main atrium. Nothing extravagant, just coffee, folding chairs, and a crowd that stretched past the security desk. Eleanor stood off to the side, wearing her cardigan and comfortable shoes, watching her son step up to the microphone. "A year ago," he said, "we learned something painful about ourselves. We learned that a company can be successful on paper and still be failing people in the hallways. We learned that silence protects the wrong side when fear is allowed to lead. And we learned that my mother is, frankly, terrifying when disguised as a janitor." People laughed, real laughter this time, warm and easy. Eleanor rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Daniel looked at her then and his voice softened. "Mom, you taught me that leadership is what we do and nobody important is watching. What you showed us is that everybody is important." The applause came fast and Eleanor felt it move through her like sunlight. She stepped up only because Daniel waved her over, and because apparently even at 71, a son can still make his mother do things in public. She looked at the crowd, at executives, engineers, janitors, assistants, security guards, people who had once rushed through the building like they were trying not to be noticed, and now stood shoulder to shoulder under the Bellamy Ridge logo. She said, "I wish I could tell you I was brave the whole time. I was not. I was angry. I was embarrassed. I was hurt. Some nights I went home and wondered whether I had made a terrible mistake by coming back this way. But then I remembered something my mother used to say after cleaning hotel rooms all day. She would say, 'Ellie, never trust a person who is only kind upward. Kindness that only climbs is not kindness. It is strategy.'" The room went quiet. Eleanor continued, "So here is what I hope we remember. The measure of this company will never be what we say about values when investors visit. It will be how we treat the person emptying the trash after everyone else has gone home. That is where the truth lives. Not on the wall, not in the handbook. There. She pointed gently toward the service hallway, and a few people turned as if seeing it for the first time. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the coffee had gone cold, Eleanor walked alone to the 44th floor conference suite. The room had been remodeled after the investigation. New chairs, warmer lighting, no portraits of executives staring down like courthouse judges. She stood by the window and looked out at the city. Gray roofs, silver river, headlights threading through evening traffic. Daniel came in quietly and stood beside her. "You okay?" She nodded. "I think so. Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor thought about Mason's face when she removed the wig. Bryce losing his smirk. Paula's polished concern cracking. Celeste walking out with nothing left but her pride. She thought about Marisol laughing in the elevator last week, about Luis complaining cheerfully that he finally had too many supplies, about Tessa leading a meeting while two senior managers took notes. "No," Eleanor said, "I regret that it was necessary. That is different." Daniel took her hand. "The building feels different now." Eleanor smiled. "Buildings do not change, Danny. People do." He looked at her. "And if they change back, then we remind them," she said. "Preferably before I have to buy another wig." He laughed, and for a moment they were not founder and CEO, not whistleblower and son, just a mother and her boy standing in the company she had built, the company he had almost lost, the company they had both learned was only worth saving if it belonged to everyone inside it. Now, I know some people hear a story like this and say Eleanor should have exposed them sooner. Others say she went too far by recording them. Some might even argue Daniel should have seen the betrayal before his mother had to walk into that building with a mop and a fake name. Maybe they are right. Maybe justice is rarely as clean as we want it to be. But I keep coming back to one simple question. If powerful people only behave decently when they know the founder is watching, were they ever decent to begin with? So let me ask you this. If you were Eleanor and you saw the company you built turning cruel from the inside, would you reveal yourself right away, or would you stay hidden long enough to prove the truth beyond doubt? And if you were Daniel, could you forgive yourself for trusting the wrong people? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this one is not just about a janitor, or a CEO, or a few executives who got what was coming to them. It is about every workplace, every neighborhood, every community where someone with a little power forgets that the person in front of them is still a person. If this story made you think of someone who deserves more respect than they get, share it with them. And if you believe justice still matters, even when it arrives wearing a gray uniform and pushing a mop bucket, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and come back for the next story.